I have a great, really a great book, The Balkans by Misha Glenny, translated into Romania at Editura 3 Publishing House. Thank you very much, Misha Glenny, for the opportunity to have a good dialogue together now today. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
You're welcome.
My first question is this one. Where would you like to live in Balkans?
That's a very good question. Let me think. I would be tempted to live close to the sea. So I think if Croatia is counting as the Balkans here, then I'd definitely like to live on a Croatian island. The Black Sea would be an interesting place to live as well. It's very difficult. Nobody's asked me that question before. For entertainment, I think Albania would be the best place to be, because the Albanians are an interesting bunch, because they are, although they have suffered as much, what can I say, ironies of history, the caprice of history, violence, invasion, imperialism, and so on, as anyone else in the Balkans. They have this Mediterranean esprit de corps, which makes them bear some of the miseries that they've had to suffer historically in a rather more, how can I say, not joyous way, but in a more dramatic way than other people. So Albania is an entertaining place to be, but each country in the Balkans have areas of outstanding natural beauty. I think in some respects, Belgrade and Bucharest are the most interesting places to be, but that's because they're relatively big cities. I think I would like to live, if I lived in a city in the Balkans, it would be one of those two.
But by the way, have you been to Romania?
Oh, yes. I first went to Romania in 1987. I was there in 1989 and 2000. So in 1987, I went and did some stories on Ceausescu's Romania, and I argued that Ceausescu was more likely, in a piece in The Guardian, you can still find it from 1987, I warned that the level of dictatorship will generally result in, the harsher the dictatorship, the more bloody the fall of the dictator when it comes. And that proved to be correct in Romania's case. So I was really struck at the time when I first went to Romania, just how poor the standard of living was relative to other countries in Eastern Europe, but even certainly relative to Yugoslavia, which had a much higher standard of living, but even relative to Bulgaria. So in Bulgaria, you could still access the agricultural produce in a way that in Romania was very, very difficult. Finding decent things to eat in Romania in 1987 was extremely hard. And Ceausescu had ordered the rationing of gas and electricity as well. And it was a particularly nasty winter. And so my feeling is that from the 1970 onwards, not necessarily before, but from the 1970s, particularly after his visit to North Korea in 1971, life became harder and harder in Romania, and the only really comparable country in the region was Albania. for similar reasons, that Ceausescu had decided, of course, after he was going to pay back the debt, that ordinary Romanians had to pay for it. And so he essentially started cutting off foreign trade relations. And it was a really, really grim experience.
What kind of great lessons from history we can take from this region, from Balkans?
Well, the most important thing as far as I'm concerned is, as you know, the Balkans in the West is always referred to as the powder keg of Europe. And I think that that is a really unfair description, because it implies that there is something inherent amongst the peoples and societies of the Balkans which is violent. But for me, the violence that was visited in and around the Balkans always had a really important, often decisive element of great power manipulation and interference. So as we know, the Balkans is where the three great imperial religions met, whether we're talking about Orthodoxy, and if not directly, then certainly by extension, the Russian Empire. The Ottoman Empire, as we know, went all the way up to Croatia, and then the Austrian and latterly the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which also moved into Bosnia-Herzegovina as well. So you had these three empires interested in controlling the Balkans, or at least influencing the Balkans. And then as the 20th century developed, and you saw the 19th and 20th centuries saw the steady collapse of imperial influence at their peripheries, i.e. at the Balkans, you saw an extraordinary increase in violence. And by this time, it wasn't just from the late 18th, early 19th century onwards, it wasn't just Austria, Russia, and Turkey. It was also France, the United Kingdom, and Italy, who were becoming, Italy a little later on, who were becoming militarily and certainly politically and certainly in terms of trade relations, very, very involved. So this was explosive because of the great power interests rather than the peoples of the Balkans themselves. And that, for me, when I was writing the book, was the most important point that I wanted to make. Now, that's not to say that you haven't had within the Balkan region some very serious differences of ethnic relations, and you haven't had your own powerful despots, kings, prime ministers, sometimes with imperial aspirations themselves, which has complicated matters. But the real force of violence comes from outside the region. What is interesting is that we look at the Balkans primarily through the prism of the 19th and 20th centuries. So if you look at the Balkans up until the end of the 18th century, or the middle of the 18th century, a lot of the Balkan region was relatively stable, and the Ottoman Empire was a promoter of religious tolerance, inasmuch that the Ottoman ideology allowed for the three peoples of the book, that is Christians, Jews, and Muslims, to practice their religions within their own community, within the millet of each of them. So that if you compare what was going on domestically in the 17th and 18th century in the Ottoman Empire, compared with what was going on in Europe with the 30 Years' War, with the Great Northern War, all the major conflicts going on in Christian Europe, one of the things you noticed is that the place where refugees went to was not another part of Europe. It was into the Ottoman Empire. And so you have a lot of Poles and Hungarians, for example, who end up in the Ottoman Empire, seeking refuge from religious persecution in Christian Europe. So, whilst life in the Ottoman Empire was very difficult for Christian peasants in particular, it was pretty brutal. There was an element of certainty in it for people who lived in the Ottoman Empire, which conferred a somewhat greater stability on the everyday experience of subjects of the Sultan than was the case in large parts of Europe. And certainly if you compare it to the center of Europe, in the territories that now make up Germany, where life was really, really uncertain and very, very distressing during the 17th century, it was essentially, in some respects, a better place to live. What then happens in the 19th century is you see with first the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and then later the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Austrian, then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is you see political power collapsing on the periphery of empire. And as political power collapses on the periphery of empire, whether it's in Greece, whether it's in Serbia, whether it's in Romania, that is where the violence emerges. That is where the mythologies of the emergence of the national myths in the 19th century are attached to liberational struggles, and the idea of the Ottoman Empire being a completely ruthless, violent oppressor of Christians in particular, but also, of course, of Jews. That's when that mythology emerges. And throughout the 20th and 21st century, people in the Balkans have tended to view the Ottoman Empire as an eternal enemy, and one which was also always violent and nasty, which wasn't necessarily the case.
From your point of view, where are the Balkans calmer or more silent? In the north, in the south, in the east, in the east, or in the west?
Depends what is going on. You could argue, for example, that Moldova is part of the Balkans,
Okay.
and if Moldova is part of the Balkans right now, it's a very frightened place for obvious reasons. So it often depends on what's going on where. But the two most neuralgic territories, without question, in the 20th, late 19th and 20th century and early 21st century were Bosnia-Herzegovina and the territory that is now called North Macedonia, because those were the territories with the highest level of contested identity, and it's where it's really where several nationalities, several aspiring nation states and collapsing empires meet. Of course, you've seen areas like Transylvania as as a contested zone throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. It flares up and then it goes down. We can see at the moment that, to a degree, Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Viktor Orban, has weaponized Transylvania to an extent, and to an extent he has tried to weaponize Slovakia as well. Now, whether he will actually light the fire on that is an unknown question. But what was very interesting in the early 1990s, when you saw the emergence of Vatra in Transylvania, you saw the difficulties in Turgomureș and partly in Cluj. There was the possibility there of Transylvania becoming more violent. And what was important at the time is the government in Bucharest and the government in Hungary had the maturity and intelligence to understand that this was really dangerous. And so on a state-to-state level, rather than try and exploit it for domestic political purposes, they actually started talking and created an atmosphere and a series of agreements which reduced the possibility of violence in Transylvania. And what was interesting is this was going on exactly the same time that Milosevic and then Tudjman were using Croatia and then Bosnia-Herzegovina in order to increase their domestic political power. So you had these two examples going on at the same time of how political leaders instrumentalize or refuse to instrumentalize identity politics. And I wrote at the time, I wrote a piece saying that we should be giving extra support and we should be publicizing both the Romanian and Hungarian governments for the excellent work they did, because Transylvania in the early 90s could have become a very serious apple of discord. So it depends on what's happening outside. It depends what's happening domestically. But usually what you need is some measure of external interference and some measure of domestic political ambition. So in Yugoslavia, you'll see that Tudjman understood immediately that if Croatia were going to get its independence, and if it were able to assert itself in Bosnia-Herzegovina, it would need support from Germany. And so Tudjman began his political campaigns by traveling more or less every week to Vienna, Munich, and Bonn in order to get support from Germany. Milosevic, of course, was looking for support from Russia, but he made the critical mistake in August 1991 of supporting the coup against Yeltsin as soon as it happened. And then Yeltsin defeated the coup, and that meant that Russia's support for Serbia throughout the war was very limited. So you have domestic and international factors playing off against each other all the time, and so the dangerous places shift, but intrinsically dangerous, most of all, are Bosnia-Herzegovina and Macedonia.
Are the Balkans the most complex of all European regions? What do you think?
Oh, well, they probably are, but let us not forget how, until the Cold War, Central Europe and the borderlands of Central Europe were also very, very complicated. And we can see now the consequences of that in Ukraine. So that area from East Germany, Poland, the Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, is, I would say, as complicated in the Balkans. But here's a really important thing. With the Yalta Agreement in 1945, Europe was divided. The West presented itself as the freedom-loving West, and how it was intolerable that Central and Eastern and Southeastern Europe was under Soviet control. But actually, for the West, the Yalta Agreement was very convenient, because it meant that those two incredibly difficult areas of the borderlands of Central Europe, the bloodlands, as historian Timothy Snyder calls them, and the, in inverted commas, powder keg of the Balkans, they were under Soviet control, or in the case of Yugoslavia, their own communist one-party state. And that meant that the West didn't have to bother with the two most difficult areas of Europe. That was being controlled effectively by Soviet tanks, even if Ceausescu created a measure of autonomy for Romania, and Yugoslavia was independent of Soviet influence more or less entirely. But that meant that American capital and Western capital was able to focus on creating a powerful European trading zone. For the Americans, this was hugely advantageous because they were producing a lot of manufactured goods, and West Germany, France, and Britain and Italy were a fantastic market for those goods. So you saw this huge rise in living standards all over Western Europe, which at the end of the war probably would have gone much more slowly and been much more complicated if the Soviets hadn't been controlling all of Eastern Europe. What that meant, of course, is that Western policymakers after 1989 and 1990 did not understand the complexities either of countries like Ukraine or of countries like Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and so on and so forth. But that's also why events like in 2007, the admission of Romania and Bulgaria to the European Union, this is a historical event, an event of historical importance, a recognition that countries like Romania and Bulgaria, with very difficult histories, are part of the European family and do deserve a place in the European Union, even if there have been teething problems over the past 15 years or so. I still regard the absorption of Romania and Bulgaria into the EU as a magnificent achievement, and one which, as I say, not without its problems, has nonetheless done a lot to stabilize Romania in particular, but to an extent Bulgaria as well.
But are the Balkans also the least understood of Europe's regions, or one of the least understood?
It's definitely one of the least understood. You know, one of the things that we saw at the end of the Cold War, when there was the collapse in the Balkans, not just the war in Yugoslavia, but also the domestic political turmoil in Romania and Bulgaria and Albania, is there were very few people in Western foreign ministries and in academia who understood the region and the individual countries. So, you know, when it came to Romania, you could count on the fingers of one hand those Western academics who really understood Romania from the inside. absolutely the case in Albania and to an extent Yugoslavia as well, because during the Cold War, all of our resources had gone into learning Russian and understanding the Soviet Union. There was very little work done on Central Europe and Southeastern Europe. So yes, it is a relatively misunderstood part of the world. And that means that when bad things happen there, when you have complicated political situations, it means you don't have the intellectual and policy tools needed to engage with it to ensure the best outcomes. So yes, I think it is very poorly understood.
What can be seen better or more clearly from the Balkans? The West, Occident, or the West, the Orient?
Well, this is very interesting because individual Balkan nations tend to understand both the Orient and the Occident better in terms of their positive points and their negative points. So when it comes to Russia, for example, Romanians know what they're dealing with when it comes to Russia. They know this partly because they're effectively neighbors, but partly because they have a complex historical relationship going back a long time, and they have considerable experience. But also, if you look at Romania, as we know, Bucharest was the Paris of the Balkans, partly because of the really significant intellectual influence of the French inside Romania. So in my experience, they have a fairly sober understanding of the West and the East. Now you can see in places like Serbia, there is a general trope, you can see it on Twitter these days, an understanding that the Serbs are basically Russian stooges inside, pawns of the Russian regime inside Southeastern Europe. And you see things like they have a traditional, friendly, close relationship with Moscow, between Belgrade and Moscow. But actually, if you go back to into history, you'll see this is not necessarily the case at all. So much of the Serbian revolution of the early 19th century was actually inspired by Serbs living in Austria and Austrian thinkers and the French Enlightenment as well. If you look at the construction of the Serbian state in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century, the key relationship was with Prussia and with Berlin. Berlin was responsible largely for building up the Serbian army at the time. In the First World War and the Second World War, the key relationship was with France and England. It was not with Russia. So this idea that there is some, consistent, powerful pan-Slavic bond between Belgrade and Moscow is historically completely false. It doesn't mean that there isn't a relationship and that there are cultural and political bonds between the two, but the idea that it is immutable, unchangeable, and that there aren't many other sorts of influence is just complete nonsense. And we see that today, although Serbia, President Vučić, has not imposed sanctions on Russia, it has condemned the invasion of Ukraine, and it is still seeking, with considerable effort, to join the European Union. And I think most Serbs understand that economically, Russia has very, very little to offer them. Actually, President Vucic at the moment in Serbia reminds me of Tsar Boris in Bulgaria in 1942 and 1943, where the Germans were pressurizing him to hand over the Bulgarian Jews. Tsar Boris had already allowed the deportation of the Jews in Western Bulgaria, i.e. what is now Northern Macedonia, Skopje, and so on. But he did not allow the deportation to Auschwitz of the Jews in core Bulgaria. And every day Tsar Boris would look at the reports coming out of Stalingrad in 1943 to see which side was winning. And when he realized that Germany was about to suffer a massive defeat in Stalingrad, he then said, I will not hand over Bulgaria's Jews to the Nazis. And I think Vucic is doing the same thing with the Russo-Ukrainian war. He's looking every day to see who is succeeding, who is failing, and he has not gone fully, he has not given his full support to Russia, precisely because he has to keep his options open. And it was clearly a wise decision to make if the events of the last few days are anything to go by, which is we're talking a week after the extraordinary turnaround in the Ukraine war through the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which has had all of us on the edge of our seats.
Is there a need for so much nationalism in this region? Is so much nationalism and so many stories of conspiracy something good for the history of the Balkans?
I wouldn't say it was good. Remember, there have been from a very early stage attempts to create a Balkan Federation. And had this been successful, it could have avoided some of the problems. But we saw what happened in as much that a mini federation in the Balkans was formed with Yugoslavia. And although it solved some of the identity problems for two periods in the interwar year and during the Cold War, ultimately it collapsed. So the European Union is another attempt at the continent trying to overcome the difficulties that nationalism and protectionism within the content, on the continent. There's problems that nationalism and protectionism create. It's obviously in a territory like the Balkans, which is relatively small, if you have a situation where everybody has their textile factory, everyone has their car manufacturing factory, and you're competing against each other all the time, that's not a very rational way of going about things. We won't really know whether a federal Balkans works until the rest of the Western Balkans become a member of the European Union. But my feeling is, and I feel this very strongly, until Brexit, the European Union underpinned the peace solution in Northern Ireland. And since Brexit, peace has no longer been guaranteed in Northern Ireland. I think that if you see all of the Balkans in the European Union, then the chances of nationalist conflict and misunderstandings and dictatorships will reduce significantly. They won't disappear, but they will reduce significantly.
How do you appreciate Romanians' standing in this area? How does Romanians' Balkan identity look to you
Romania,
from distance?
It's interesting because Romania has multiple identities. First of all, it has, and this intellectually has been extremely important, it has the Romance identity, obviously rooted in its language. This means that although Romania is I've always found this fascinating, separated from the rest of the Romance language group. It means there is an emotional and intellectual connection between Romania and Western Europe that simply doesn't exist with the other countries. And of course, since Romanians have been able to travel, it's a huge advantage to Romania that they can learn to speak Italian or Spanish or French in the space of about 2 or 3 months. And even when they first arrive in Italy or Spain, Romanians can make themselves understood. So that part of the Romanian identity is really important. But Transylvania is very much an Austrian and a Hungarian zone as well as a Romanian zone. And the traditions of Transylvania, I think, are very different from the Regat and from Moldova. And so I personally really understand that everywhere from Iași, maybe down to the Serbian border, that is really the proper Balkan part of Romania. And I don't necessarily see Eastern Moldova in particular, today's Moldavia, I don't necessarily see them as part of the Balkans. I see them more as part of that northern Black Sea area. So Romania has, I think, moved in and out of the Balkans over its modern history. Sometimes it's fully integrated into what's going on with the Balkans. Sometimes it's completely separate. And so the answer to that is that Romania is one of those fascinating borderlands which can shift its identity. But because of that Romance identity, it has one of the most powerful senses of self as a nation in the entire region. That language connection is really critical.
Thank you very much, Mr. Misha Glenny. We have a huge and an amazing book, Balkans, by Misha Glenny, Trei Publishing House. Thank you very much for the privilege of this dialogue. It was a great pleasure for me.
Cristian, thank you very much. I now currently work as the rector of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, in Austria, and that means that I'm able to return to do some work on the Balkans, and I hope fairly soon to be visiting Bucharest, probably next year, in which case I'd love to come and talk to people in person.
Thank you very much. It will be a great pleasure.